Hello, let's talk about the terrible transformation. It's a term that was used quite a bit. Wait a minute, phone's ringing here. What? Hello. Yes, I was just getting ready to talk about the terrible if you'd let me finish, transformation. No, not Transformers, that's Bumblebee and something else. Transformation. Transformation means a change. Right. And terrible means terrible. Right, yeah. So terrible transformation. Something that changes that is not right. Something that's terrible, right. Well, why would you call me now and ask me this? I'm just now starting a video on it. Right. So you transformed into a psychic. That's really just great. That's great. All right. Well, what do you see in your future right now about this phone call? I'm going to hang up on you. That's what you see? My gosh, you were right. Jeez, let me do my video. I have no idea. That was the wrong number. Anyways, transformation means to change. So we have this idea that something happened in the New World, the British Colonies that turned into the United States of America, right? Something transformed. Basically, slavery transformed. Slavery changed from slavery based on like indentured servitude, based on your socioeconomic level, like very low, poor, indentured servant. It changed from that to slavery based on race completely. And here's a little background. I know I talked about it a little before, but obviously, and I'm not overlooking this at all, white slavery has been around for as long as humans have been around. It's something that's not very nice to think about, but as humans, we have enslaved other humans for thousands of years, perhaps more. White slavery, the slavery of people of the same race, has been going on and it's been documented since the early Greeks and the Romans. The early Greeks and Romans enslaved perhaps thousands of years, and it wasn't based on color. It was this idea of your culture, where you came from, or if you were a prisoner of war, you were captured in a battle. So a lot of times this is how it happened. So it wasn't based on race. And in fact, back in early history, when the Greeks and the Romans were writing about these issues and about their history, they never mentioned race. Race wasn't really even thought of or as a term. Because if you think about it, we're all of one race. We're all human. So the changes in color, our looks, our hair color, eye color, our stature, short, tall, squatty, thin, those are all cultural, and they're not race. So really the Greeks and the Romans had it correct a long time ago. However, you will hear me use the word race to talk about slavery changing from slavery based on who you are to based on race, which we are obviously talking about people of color. From slavery, transformation of slavery to based on race. We're going all the way back to the colonial days, 1619. Actually, before 1619, 1607, the founding of Jamestown. Yes, of course, we've learned all about that. But what interesting was happening in Jamestown even before 1619, which is a humongously important date, which if you're looking at this worksheet, we're going to be getting to that momentarily. But even before 1619, the English sent ships to this new colony, the New World, full of basically kidnapped kids, kidnapped orphans. They sent lots of people over that were considered homeless, vagrants, criminals. There was even, at one point, they sent over the Jamestown Company. Remember, it was a company, it was for profit, we talked about that. There was at one time even, it was called a bridal boat. They sent over more than 100 women Some of them were homeless. Some of them did not go willingly. Some of them had no choice, either be locked up in an English prison or go to the New World. Some of them went willingly just to get out of the incredible poverty that was going on in England at the time. And some of them were basically, yeah, told you're going over. But these bridal boats were brought over for wives for the men in Jamestown. Some of these women were basically bought as wives. Some of them were indentured servants, which served, most indentured servants served about 5 to 7 years of service and then were given their freedom dues. We'll talk about that in a moment. There was also a ship brought over of just all boys, young boys, basically your ages and younger. And they were sold into indentured servitude. They were supposedly told in England that they were coming over to become not indentured servants, but apprentices. They would be not necessarily sold. This was the paper story. They were apprenticed to a craftsman to learn a trade, and then they would work, and then they would get their freedom. Well, most of this turned out to be basically a slavery, a form of slavery. These young boys were bought and sold openly in markets in colonial days. And then we get up to 1619. Very interesting. In 1619, the story goes, 20 and odd Negroes landed from and were taken from a Dutch man-of-war, a Dutch ship. 20 and odd, meaning 20 and an odd number, probably. No one really knows how many. It was probably more than 20. So they were basically kidnapped by a Dutch merchant and brought to the Jamestown. And in order for the Dutch merchants to get their ship back home, they traded these kidnapped Africans as indentured servants, as the story goes. They were given Christian names and baptized, and then, so according to Christian law at the time, they could not be made slaves. Well, that's how the story goes. There are a couple peculiarities to that. There is reports, and I got it from this book and several others, that a woman who was actually sold as a slave to a man in Jamestown, sold as a slave to become his wife, more likely. And that is documented evidence. So to say all of these black people, these Africans, I should say, these Africans came over to be indentured servants and then they got their freedom is not exactly correct. Some of them did, of course. And for a while, there was not, don't want to say harmony, but there was a lot of cooperation between the white indentured servants, the black indentured servants, and they worked side by side for quite some time. And what happened was, in Virginia, tobacco, we talked about John Rolfe and bringing in tobacco. Tobacco was grown, and tobacco needs a lot of labor to become profitable. It's a crop that just cannot stand by itself and grow. Bless you, the dog sneezed. So they needed more and more labor. Well, at the same time, in England, stories of the horrific conditions of indentured servants were coming back to England. Indentured servitude sounded really good on paper, and it did. Most indentured servants were signed a contract to work for 5 to 7 years, and at the end of that 5 to 7 years, they were given these freedom dues, and they were supposed to get, basically, a bushel of corn, a new suit of clothes, and 100 acres of land. And there are reports I've read in this book. Women indentured servants were given less, of course. I mean, that's just the name of the game back then, and unfortunately it kind of is still today, although we're working on it. And there are reports that the men were given a gun at the end of their indentured servitude. But these contracts were easily broken. They were easily swindled, these indentured servants, into becoming basically slaves. On paper, they weren't bought and sold to like a master, but they were slaves. So, and they were treated horribly. A lot of these indentured servants were treated like animals, like cattle, like they were owned. So these stories of the horrific conditions got back to England, and a lot of indentured servants, that flow of indentured servants into the colonies kind of dried up. Well, if you have tobacco and you need a labor force to make a profit, and of course Jamestown was a profit-making colony. It was there to make money. They needed more labor. Well, it slowly switched over, and that's the transformation. During this time, also, the first black child was born in the colonies, and I believe it was in Jamestown. William Tucker was his name, and he was born in 1624 in the colonies. I just think that's kind of a bit of trivia that obviously I did put on our note taker there, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But what happened was 1640. 3 servants ran away from their master, which was not that unusual. If you can imagine being treated terribly, you would probably want to look for a way out, and the slaves and the, slaves, indentured servants did look for ways to run away, and they certainly did. Well, in 1640, 3 servants ran away. 2 of them white, I think of Irish descent, one of them a black man named John Punch. They were caught, and they were given punishment. They were punished. However, the one black man, John Punch, was given the punishment of the time of his natural life as a servant, life as a servant. Until that moment, no white servant had ever been given that punishment. Usually they get punishment of like 30 stripes, which is a whip, and added time to the years, 4 extra years of indentured servitude. But until then, no white had ever been given the punishment as servant for life. And actually, servant for life is just another name, for a slave, is it not? Absolutely. So here we have, that's the slow transformation. It did not happen overnight. We're talking 50, 100, 150 years. And you're talking all the way back to 1640. This was 140 years before the United States became the United States. So you're talking about 140 years just traveling from the time of the transformation to when the colonies began to rebel. So this is something that did not happen overnight. And something interesting, in 1641, it was actually Massachusetts that first recognized slavery as legal. And you think of Massachusetts as a northern colony. And I know we talk a lot about the southern colonies being very much involved in slavery, and we will get to that. But at the beginning, the northern colonies looked at slavery and said they were the first, Massachusetts was the first to make it legal. And slavery began being defined by race, the color of your skin. To be black would to be a slave, and to be a slave would be black. There's a lot of interesting components to that, and what we like to think about is somewhat the obvious. It's easier to recognize a slave if they were of color than a runaway indentured servant or a runaway slave if they were white. And that's a horrible thing to think about, a horrible thing to consider, but that was a huge part of it. If you were working and living in the colonies and you saw a black woman, it was easier to, okay, they're black, they're a slave. They should have papers on them. They should be owned by somebody. They should be out and about for a reason. Whereas if you were a white person living in the colonies and you pass another white person, even if they're of lower, status and, the way their cloth or their clothing, their manner of speech, if they're white, they were probably free. Yes, racist, absolutely. No doubt about it. But that is our history, and that is part of our history, like I like to tell you, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which is a good movie, by the way. I think it was Clint Eastwood, maybe. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Yes, we get to some good. Yes, we have some bad. And I think slavery is the ugly. And part of that is racism, and part of that is just the stain, like you heard from the movie, the stain of slavery. And that's what I kind of look at. So here we have, by 1641, Massachusetts is the first to recognize slavery as legal. And slavery is now beginning to be defined by race, and not so much as your class or your culture. It was race. We get up to 1672. Still the colonies, still the King of England is running the colonies, still more than 100 years away, roughly 100 years away from rebellions in the colonies against King George III, leading to the Revolutionary War. We have the King of England forming the African Company, which by his stroke of the pen, started bringing in enslaved, kidnapped Africans in the colonies. He himself, through the African Company, brought in more than 900,000 Africans into the colonies. And if you remember, Thomas Jefferson, when we talked about the Declaration of Independence, he wanted to add in the Declaration of Independence about how this scourge of slavery was the king's fault. Well, come on. Jefferson profited highly from the slave industry. He owned more than 200, probably, well, I think during his lifetime he owned like over 600 slaves. He had a slave wife, Sally Hemings. So to blame it all on the King of England is kind of a stretch. But in 1672, England, the king knew how important the slave trade would be to the profit, cha-ching, in the colonies. So he himself started this African Company. And by 1691, this idea of race, if you were black, you were a slave. If you were a slave, you were black. By 1691, it was illegal to free a slave, a black slave, unless they were going to leave the colony itself. And these are just some of the little laws that started chipping away at the freedom of Africans, the freedom of the black indentured servants, the freedom of blacks in general, and the freedom of the kidnapped Africans. It didn't happen overnight. We've already covered almost 100 years. And then you get up to 1705, and in Virginia, southern colony, Jamestown, by 1705, Virginia slaves were considered property and sold as real estate. So we went all the way from basically 1607 in Jamestown to 1705. You're talking about close to 100 years. And there were more and more laws that came out even after the 1705 Virginia law. And you don't really need to know these, but they were called the slave codes. And each one of them took a little bit more of that freedom away from being a black person in the colonies and then a black person in then the new United States to being thought of as, hey, there's a black man, they have to be a slave. Otherwise, there's something probably really wrong. They should have some papers. To be a slave was to be black was to be a slave. It was very unusual that a black man or woman in the South, and this is where it really kind of transformed also, the South started to really rely more on slavery, and it was unusual for a black person in the South to be free. Yes, there were. We're going to get to that. There were hundreds, thousands of freed blacks in the South, but it made a lot of the people nervous, and I'm getting way ahead of myself from our little talk here on the terrible transformation. Let me recommend a couple of things here. Also, this book, Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, required reading for every American. And if I had the money, this would be our textbook. As you can see from this book, has been used a couple times. It's kind of dog-eared and bent up. Excellent book, Howard Zinn. Also, yes, I talked about the history of white people. I'm not recommending this book for middle school. It is a tough read. For high school, it's a tough read. For college, it's not an easy read. And for me, I read this book twice, and parts of it I've read 3 or 4 times, still trying to figure out what is this woman talking about. But incredible piece of literature, of historic proportions here. Interesting book. Kind of changed the way I look at a few things. So there you go. So we have this transformation, change, transform, from indentured servitude to slavery, a transformation. So thank you for listening, and away we go.